Good morning. Today's daf is daf Tzadik Hey. We are at the Mishnah on Tzadik Dalet Amabet. So let me share my screen and we will get started. Today, okay, so hold on just a second. Here we go. We are continuing to discuss the obligation to launder blood stains when the blood of a chatas gets on somebody's clothing. And so far, we've seen that the obligation is one, only triggered by blood that could be put on the altar. Two, applies only for garments that could become susceptible to tuma. And three, requires that the cleaning happen in the temple courtyard. So as we pick up with the Mishnah near the bottom of Tzadik Dalet Amabet, the Gemara now details what happens if something happens to the stained garment, the earthenware vessel, or the copper vessel. So again, with earthenware vessels, if it cooks a chatas in the meat of a chatas in it, you need to destroy it. And if a copper vessel, you need to purge it and rinse it. And so the question, and all of that needs to happen within the azara, within the temple courtyard. And the question is what happens if these items leave the temple courtyard? How do we deal with it? What's going to happen? Do we say, well, it's left and therefore everything's fine, or therefore there's nothing to be done about it? Let's take a look, and that's what our Mishnah is going to discuss. So we begin again, Mishnah on Tzadik Dalet Amabet, towards the bottom of the daf. Beged sheyatza chutz l'kloim. So if you have a garment that goes outside the curtains, now the reference to curtains is a reference to the courtyard, but it's the courtyard in the Mishkan. The Mishkan, of course, was the movable sanctuary that traveled with the Jewish people in the wilderness and then came into the land of Israel with them and ended up standing for several hundred years until they built the Beis Hamikdash. And so as a result, even though when we refer to it, we're really thinking about the Beis Hamikdash, we're using the language of the Chumash, which was the curtains indicating what the courtyard is. So in any event, if that garment, the stained garment with the blood of a chatas leaves the curtains, leaves the courtyard, and so obviously that's not where you're supposed to. It's not where it's supposed to be. It needs to be brought back in order to launder it in the courtyard. Nichnas umechavsu b'makom kadosh. Okay, so you fix it by bringing it back into the curtains, bringing it back into the courtyard, and then you can wash it in that holy place. So, but what happens, nitma chutz l'klayim, what happens if it becomes tameh while outside the curtains? And Rashi explains that what's the problem if it becomes tameh? So nitma chutz l'klayim, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines up in the narrow lines of Rashi on Tzadik Dalet Amabet from the bottom of the narrow lines. So nitma chutz l'klayim la'achar sheyatza, after it left, it becomes tameh. V'iyavshar lahachnis tumah la'azara. You're not allowed to bring something that's tameh into the courtyard. So what are we now supposed to do? So kora'o, you rip it. And Rashi explains, keep your finger in Rashi, the next Rashi, kora'o, v'tahor, it will become tahor mitumah, from the tumah that it had. Umutter lahachniso v'nichnas umechabso b'makom kadosh, because it leaves the category of being a formal garment that is capable of becoming tameh, and now it's just a piece of fabric. It is no longer tameh, and now you can bring it in. So nichnas umechabso b'makom kadosh. You bring it in and you launder it in a holy place. Now you might be wondering, well, why don't you just put the garment in the mikvah and it will become tahor, and then you can bring it into the Beis Hamikdash whole? Why do you need to rip it? And the answer is, at least according to some Rishonim, is the fact that if you were to put it in the mikvah, some of the blood might get cleaned, and that you'd be cleaning the blood outside of the Azara, and we don't want any cleansing to happen outside the Azara because the Torah explicitly says that we need to cleanse this garment inside in the Kodesh. So kli cheres sheyatza chutz l'klayim. We need to cleanse it in a makom kadosh, I should say. So kli cheres sheyatza chutz l'klayim. So same question with respect to an earthenware vessel that was used to cook a chatas. So if it went outside the curtains, so nichnas v'shovro b'makom kadosh. So bring it back in, and then you'll break it in the holy place. Nitma chutz l'klayim. What happens if it became tamei outside? So nokvo, put a hole in it, because again, when it comes to a kli, it will lose its status of a kli depending on the usage of that particular vessel based on the size of the hole. So here, a small hole will undermine the ability of this earthenware vessel to be useful, and so as a result, it will no longer be tameh. You can bring it back in, v'nichnas v'shover b'makom kadosh, and you can bring it back in and break it in a holy place. What about a copper vessel, kli nechoshes, sheyatza chutz l'klayim? If it goes outside, same rule, nichnas umorako v'shotfo b'makom kadosh. Bring it back in, and then you do the purging and the rinsing in a holy place. Nitma chutz l'klayim. What happens if it became tameh? Well, pochato. You need to create a big hole in the item. V'nichnas l'morko and v'nichnas, and then you can bring it back in. Umorko v'shotfo b'makom kadosh, and then it can be purged and cleansed in the holy place. So that was our Mishnah, and so the Gemara now goes through and tries to understand how each of these things works. Because after all, the items that we need to cleanse or break or purge and rinse are a garment, an earthenware vessel, and a copper vessel. And if we are ripping the garment, making a hole in the earthenware vessel and breaking and making a breach, a large hole in the copper vessel, aren't these things no longer garments and vessels? And so as a result, why would we have any obligation with respect to them? That's the Gemara's question that we're going to ask 3 different times, once on the garments, once on the earthenware vessel, and once on the copper vessel. So let's take a look. So Maskivlo, Ravina asked, Koro, if you rip the garment, so Beged, Amar Rachmana, V'la Begedhu. How could you even think that you have to still apply the rule of washing it? The Torah tells us that we have to wash a beged, and this is no longer a garment. So how can we deal with that? And moreover, how can you rip it? Meaning, what is ripping save you? Yeah, you can bring it back in, but it's not going to be subject to the obligation to cleanse it any longer. As we saw yesterday and the day before, only things that are begadim and capable of becoming tamei are subject to the obligation to cleanse. So the Mishayir Bei Kedemo Ma'afores. What the key is you don't rip it in two completely to separate it into 2 halves that would then be useless and not be able to be considered as still a garment, but rather, or may you be effectively making it into new garments, which again would be completely separate. So the point is that you leave an amount that is needed for a kerchief. And so as a result, the idea is, as Rashi says, first of the medium Y lines in Rashi, Mishayir Bay, Shelo Yavdil Es Hakara Al Panei Kulo. You don't make a full separation with the rip through the entire length of the document, the garment. L'chalok es habeged, to divide the garment, lishnayim, into 2 pieces. Ela Mishayir Bo Kidei Rochav Suda, but rather you leave out of the whole garment an amount that is the size of a kerchief. Demetumato tahor, that if you do such a large rip, it will no longer be tamei, hoil v'nikra rubo, because most of the garment is ripped, and so as a result, we'll treat it as if it's completely ripped, and therefore it's not going to be tameh. The cave and shishayir bo kedema afores, but since you still have a kerchief left of the connection between the two halves, roi lechabro, you can tie it together, the rest of it together, v'shmo alav, and bisamu alav, and you can put it on a person, ubeged karinan beg, and we would call that still a garment, and that doesn't require any formal action, but rather it's still sort of, if you have intention for it to be a garment, it's a garment. And so as a result, it would still be subject to the rule that it's capable of potentially becoming tameh if you were to decide that that's what you were going to do with it. And so as a result, it stays in the category of beged, and therefore it's going to work. So Aini, the Gemara asks, is this really true? V'amar Rav Huna, meaning that is it really true that if you leave a small amount intact, the tuma will leave the garment? Because listen to what Rav Huna said. Lo shanu ela shelo shir ba kedei ma'aforis. That when it comes to a particular Mishnah in Kalim, this is a Mishnah in Kalim, Mishnah Kafchet, Mishnah Perek Kafchet, Mishnah Chet, that talks about a garment that's ripped along most of its width or its length, and it's treated as if it's ripped completely in two, and therefore it's tahor. And and Rav Huna says about that Mishnah that the Mishnah is talking about where there was not enough for a kerchief, meaning that it was less than that amount. Aval shir ba kedei ma'afores chibur havi. But if in fact it's considered, if you did leave a full kerchief amount of the rip unripped, and then it would be considered connected, and it would remain tamei, as Rashi says, aval shir ba kedei ma'aforos chibur havi v'adayin hu b'tumato. It would remain in its tuma state. So how can you say that our process of bringing this beged back into the Beis Hamikdash is based on ripping it until there's only a kerchief size amount? We said, Rav Huna said in connection with Maseches Kalim, that leaving a kerchief sized amount doesn't take the garment out of being tameh, and so you can't bring it back into the Beis Hamikdash. So how do you explain the fact that we're saying now that that's sufficient? So midrabanan, who when Rav Huna said that it's still tameh, he was saying that it's tameh from the rabbis because, and Rashi explains why is it still tameh. Top Rashi on Tzadikayim and Aleph midrabanan. It's tameh is rabbinic because Gzeira Dilma lo asya lemikra ruba. Maybe you won't go so far as to rip the entire or the majority of the document aval midoraisa, but biblically tahora, as long as you rip the majority of the document, excuse me, I keep saying document, I don't know why, the majority of the garment, well then you've ripped the majority of the garment, and therefore it's going to be tahor midoraisa, umuter lahachnisa mishum mitzvahs kibus, and you would be able to bring it into the Beis Hamikdash based on the mitzvah of having to wash the document, wash the garment. God, I don't know why I keep doing that. Anyway, so the point is that the garment is now going to be tahor midoraisa, and Rav Huna's statement that says that if there's still a kerchief size left to the rip, that's only telling us that rabbinically it would still be tameh, but we're not going to worry about that here because we have a biblical command that effectively will override that rabbinic prohibition. Okay. All right. So next ruling. So now we talked about how the ripping of the garment works. Now the question is, how does the puncturing of the earthenware vessel work? So kli cheres sheyatza. Again, we had in our Mishnah, if the earthenware vessel goes outside, you got to bring it back in, and if it's tameh, you got to break it, and then it works, and then you can bring it in. So nokvo, you puncture it, you make a hole. So kliya marachmana velo kliyu. But once you made this hole, now this item, this pot's not a vessel any longer. And so how can you say that it's good to that it still requires the breaking of it? You've already broken it. So shenika b'shorish katan. No, you break it the size of a small root, and so as a result, even though that is a hole that is large enough to take it out of the category of vessel, it doesn't take it out of the category completely because it still has potential uses. Namely, you can use it to hold olives or other things in it. And therefore, it's even though its original use is not good, and therefore it's no longer tame, it's still in the ballpark of being called a kli, and therefore it's going to be still subject to the requirement that you need to break it, and you'll break it in the courtyard. So what about a kli nechoshes? And we say pochato that you need to breach it. V'halav klihu, and we have the same problem that it's not going to be a vessel. So here, deratzif mirtzif, you're going to bang it together. You hammer it together, as Rashi tells us. Second line in the narrow lines of Rashi, deratzif le mirtzaf. Achar shepochto. Once you've breached the item, makin alav bekornos, you bang it with a hammer, umechabro, and that will connect the pieces again. V'chazer shem kli alav, and now it will once again be a kli. V'gabi kli cheres. So that's how we deal with the copper vessel, because now it's a kli again, and so as a result we can bring it back in, and it's tahor, and you can purge it and rinse it in the makom kadosh. V'gabi kli cheres ikalamemer denikvo demasnisin b'motzi mashka l'taher. That when we say that the point is that that it's sufficient to make a hole in it such that liquid would come out, that's sufficient. V'adayin klihu. It's sufficient in order to make it tahor, but it remains a vessel. L'kabel zaytim, because you can put olives in it. B'mesechet Shabbos b'perak hamatzniya. So if you take a look at in Shabbos daf nut tzadikei amud bet, so that explains how there are several different levels of holes that we can make in something, and depending on the nature of how you use an item beforehand, it will determine the hole that is necessary in order to make it not usable any longer. And so in this case, the hole that is at least large enough to break, for liquid to come out, so then that will be sufficient to do the job of taking it out of the category of being tameh, even if it keeps it in the category of being a vessel. Okay, so Amaresh Lakish, Me'il Shenitma. What about one of the garments that the Kohen Gadol wears? It's a robe that is, that he wears. What happens if it gets blood on it, and then it goes out of the Beis Hamikdash and becomes tamei? So here we cannot just rip it, as Rashi tells us. Me'il, 1, 2, 3, from the top of Rashi, the narrow lines, it's the eighth line down, first word on the line. Me'il shall bigdei kuhuna, the robe of the garments of the Kohen. Shenitas alav dam, where blood was splattered on it. Dam chatas, from a chatas offering. V'yatza, v'yetz, and it left v'yatza, and it left the courtyard. Chutz l'klayim, outside the curtains. V'nitma, and now it became tamei. Machlis makom hadam lifnim. We need to bring the place of the blood inside. And what do we do? So me'il shenidma machliso b'pachot mishalosh al shalosh umchabso. You bring in very small amounts every time you bring into the courtyard, less than a 3x3 amount of space, and then you cleanse it. And why do we need to do that? Mishum shenemar lo yikareya, because the Torah says that you're not allowed to rip it, right? The Torah specifically says, Perek Kavchet in Shmot, Pasuk Lamed Bet, Lo Yikareya. And so as a result, uh, and Rashi tells us, "B'pachot mishalosh al shalosh she'eno machnas shir beged," because by doing such small amounts, you're not bringing into the courtyard the amount of size of a garment. Beged tameh of an impure garment, la'azara, and you're not bringing it into the courtyard. Lefi she'i efshar lekoro, and the reason that we can't just make it tahor is because you can't rip it. So, and then bring it in. Mishum shenemar lo yikareya, because the Torah tells us you're not allowed to affirmatively rip the Kohen Gadol's robe. So that is what one does in connection with that. So now Mosif Rav Ada Bar Ahava, Rav Ada Bar Ahada says, 1 second, why is it that you focus on not bringing in a 3 finger by 3 finger amount of fabric? Ha'avin v'harakin ein bahem mishum shalosh al shalosh. We have a Mishnah in Maseches Kalim that's the 28th Perek Mishnah Chet, where it says that when it comes to thick cloths and soft cloths, you do not have the rule of 3 by 3, because a regular cloth that's 3 by 3 you can use as a a kerchief and do things with it. But if it's too fragile or too thick, that small amount of material is useless. You need a larger amount of material. As Rashi says, Ein bahem mishum shalosh al shalosh, dilav levisha chazu. These thick cloths and very soft cloths are not fit for using as garments. V'lav l'takin bahen chalak, and you can't use them to fix a garment. Elisha valav, but rather they're used for sitting on. They're placemats essentially. V'tzarach shlosha al shlosha, and therefore they don't need 3 by 3 fingers. They need 3 by 3 tfachim. Umeil av hu, and the me'il of the Kohen Gadol was thick. Kedekaimelan beseder yuma, as we learned in Maseches Yuma, chutan, the threads of the me'il, kaful shnemasar, they are effectively 12-fold, and so as a result, there's essentially 12 threads in every thread. Vafilu shalosh al shalosh yachlis, and therefore a 3 by 3 finger breadth amount should be able to go in. You should be able to bring in larger amounts. So why did you, Reish Lakish, tell us that you could only bring in 3 fingers by 3 fingers, or you had to bring in less than 3 fingers by 3 fingers? It's a thick cloth, and therefore it should be able to be have brought in. You can bring in up to 3 tfachim by 3 handbreadths, 3 tfachim by 3 tfachim, which is much larger. So no, agav avi and chashive. No, the point is, the Gemara answers that because they are all still connected to a larger garment, it's more important. They have greater significance. And therefore, even though you're right that if we only focused on a small cloth of thick material, you would be allowed to bring in even 3 finger breadths up to 3 tfachim, but because these 3 finger breadths are still connected to the overall garment, because we can't rip it. So as a result, we have to be more stringent, and we treat it as even 3 finger breadths as being a problem. Okay, so vaha boy shiva samimim. So now the Gemara wonders, 1 second. Here we have a real problem, because what are we supposed to do with this garment? We're supposed to cleanse it. So we're now sort of done with the taking out issue, but now we're focused on how do we cleanse it. Well, there's a list of detergents in a Mishnah in Maseches Nida, and this list of detergents includes something called mei raglayim, namely urine. Now, we say on a regular basis that you can't bring urine into the Beis Hamikdash. It's part of the paragraph that we talk about when we recite at least every Shabbos the rules of the Ketoret, of the incense, and some people say it every day. And so, as a result, in connection with that, there's an idea that you're not supposed to bring in urine. And yet, here we need to use the seven detergents. So as let's take a look and see how the Gemara asks the question. Shiva Summon. 1 second. We need the seven different kinds of detergents, of spices that are going to be used to cleanse the garment. To Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabba Bar Ravuha, Dam Chatas, that when it comes to the blood of a chatas that needs to be cleaned out of a garment, Umaros Nagayim, and when it comes to the tsaras that also needs to be washed, Tzrichin Shiva Samamin. You have to use all seven of the different kinds of cleansing detergents. Vitanya, and yet we learned in a brisa. This is the language that we quote on Shabbos and in Karbanot every day. Ela she'ein machnisin mei raglayim lemikdash. We don't bring the urine into the Beit Hamikdash, and so as we turn to Tzadik Heyam and Bet, the Gemara offers one theoretical possibility, which it immediately rejects. Maybe you're thinking, oh, all right, so just combine all seven ingredients and the majority won't be urine, and therefore we won't treat it as urine because we follow the majority, and we could just do that. That doesn't work. Umavar Allahu kula kula kachan, and maybe we'll apply all seven of them all at once to the bloodstain. V'hatzanan, but the Mishnah in Nida says He'eviran shelo kisidran o shehevir shivasan ke'echad. If you put them on out of sequence or you put them on all together, lo asav lo klum. You haven't done anything. That's not the way these detergents get used. And if you say, well, all right, so let's mix the urine with one of the other ingredients and we'll use a majority of the other ingredients. But that doesn't work either. Case shalosh pamim bekol echad ve'echad tnan. We say that you have to scrub 3 times with each ingredient individually, is what the Mishnah says there. So Ella demavla lahu birok tafel. So actually, you know what? We're gonna follow. You do mix it. You mix it with the first of the 7 items. The first of the 7 items is a certain kind of saliva. It's the saliva that you have in the morning before you eat anything, right when you wake up. It's like a very powerful saliva, and that saliva is what you will mix the urine with, and you'll use a majority of the saliva, so it won't be considered urine. And now how can you do that? Because after all, doesn't it say that we're supposed to do each ingredient individually? Well, no, because the Amarish Lakish wrote Tafel Tzarok Sheyehe Im Kol Echad Be'echad. The saliva needs to be mixed with each and every ingredient. Meaning, item number 1 on the list is the saliva by itself. Item number 2 on the list, which is megrisin, a chewed bean paste. So then you mix that chewed bean paste with the tasteless, with the saliva. And then the third item is mei raglayim. So you mix the mei raglayim with the saliva, and so on and so on. And so as a result, there are in fact 7 different ingredients, and that you can do in order, and every one of them is going to be able to be used. And the point is that when you use it as a detergent, we can mix enough saliva so that it's not considered urine, even though the urine is the key ingredient in the detergent. Okay, so now that we figured out how we're going to wash, let's now take a look at some of the rules associated with the pots that we were talking about. Again, the rules are that if you have an earthenware pot that cooks kodshe kodshim in it, you're going to need to break it. And if you have a metal pot, well, then you have to do marika ushtifa. You have to do purging and rinsing in order to get the taste out. So let's take a look and see what the next Mishnah says. So echad. So again, this Mishnah is addressing the breadth of the obligation to purge and rinse metal utensils. Echad shabishal bo ve'echad she'erab l'tocho roteach. Whether you cooked in the vessel or you poured hot broth that had the meat of the chatas, or meat of one of the kodshim in it, echad kodshei hakodshim, echad kodshim kalim, whether it was kodshim kodshim or kodshim kalim, te'una marika ushtifa. You're going to need the purging and the rinsing, and of course, if it was an earthenware vessel, you would need to break it. Rabbi Shimon disagrees with our Tanakama and says no. Kachim kalim ain't te'una marika ushtifa. When it comes to kachim kalim, it doesn't need the purging and the rinsing. Only kachim kodshei require the purging and the rinsing. Okay, so again, so Tana Rabbanan. So the rabbis explain, how do I know these rules? So the Gemara quotes a brisa that seeks the source for the need to do purging and rinsing when boiling liquid is poured into the vessel. Meaning it's not cooking, so formally cooking, so why does it require it? So Tana Rabbanan, asher tuvushal bo, that if you cook in it, then that's what's going to need to either, this is a pasuk about being broken, this is the pasuk Vayikra Perek Vav Pasuk Kaf Aleph. So Ainli Ella should be Shelbo. That teaches us that all these obligations of breaking the earthenware vessel and purging and rinsing the copper vessel, those are when you cook in it. Eira Latoko Rotech Minayin. How do I know that the same rule applies if you pour hot something into it? So Talmud Lomar. Asher tivushal bo yishaver, that anything that you cook in it, it shall be broken. So the point is that bo yishaver, the as Rashi says, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 lines down in the narrow lines on Tzadik Hayamabet, Asher bo yishaver, that the fact is that because midisamech yishaver, Eitzel bo, the fact that the Torah chose the phraseology of connecting in it, which is a generic word, and yishaver, and the breaking, the low kasav, and the Torah did not write im bekli cheres tivushal yishaver, and it did not say that if you cook in a earthenware vessel, if in an earthenware vessel you cook, you should break it. So as a result, the cooking and the breaking are not next to each other, but rather the vessel and the breaking are next to each other in the words in Hebrew. Lemidrash, it tells us, it's teaching us, im nivla bo mikol makom yishaver. What matters is just that it absorbed some taste. And so as a result, although pouring hot water into something will not engage in cooking in the item, it will transfer taste to that item, to that pot. And so as a result, the pot has absorbed some taste, and therefore it's going to be need to be broken if it's earthenware, and it's going to need purging and rinsing if it's metal. So by Rami Bar Chama asked the following question. Tilo ba'avir tanur mahu. What happens if instead of cooking in the item where the item is connected to the pot, we suspend it using a skewer in the air of the oven, and now the meat that's on that skewer never touches, and neither does any of the grease. Nothing ever touches the oven itself. And so the question is, do we still say that oven, if it's earthenware, needs to be broken, and if it's metal, it needs to be purged and rinsed? Because after all, the Torah references cooking in it, and here this oven or pot was cooked in. Abishol, as continuing on in the Gemara, Abishol ubilua hu dekapid rachmana, meaning, do we need the cooking and the absorption? Odilma abishol below bilua, or is it sufficient to have just the cooking alone without the absorption. So Amarava Tashma, maybe we can prove it from our Mishnah, Echad Shabishal Bo Vechad She'era L'Toko Roteach, that the rule applies whether you cook in it or you pour hot broth in it. And so the pouring of hot broth shows that just one of these items is sufficient. Namely, it's sufficient to have bilua, even if you don't have bishul. So the implication that Rava wants to suggest is just as bilua is sufficient without cooking, so too cooking would be sufficient without bilua. But the Gemara says, I don't buy it. Bilua below bishul lo kami bailon. I'm not asking you about absorption without cooking. Kimli bailon, where I'm asking you is bishul below bilua mai. I'm asking you about cooking without absorption, meaning you haven't affected the item itself. And so maybe there's a different rule. So Tashma, we try again to learn from the following. To Amar of Nachman Amar Rabba Baravuha Tanner Shel Mikdash Shel Matechas Haya. The oven in the Beis Hamikdash needed to be made of metal. Now, why did it need to be made of metal? Well, our thought is the following. Now, if you were to tell me that, in fact, if you were to cook in an earthenware vessel without the meat touching the side, you're not going to need to break the item. Why not use an earthenware oven in the Beis Hamikdash? After all, the way it's cooked is on a spit, and so as a result, let's just use the spit and everything will be great. So the answer is, and so therefore, why must it be that we use specifically a metal? It must be that even if you cook on a spit in an earthenware vessel, it's going to require the requirement to break it, and that's why they don't use it in the Beis Hamikdash. And so, doesn't that show that even cooking without absorption is going to create an obligation to break earthenware, and by analogy, also require shtifa and marika and shtifa for a metal vessel, the purging and the rinsing for a metal vessel? No, not necessarily. Kevan de'ika shiare menachos de'afiyasan betanur. Well, it's that tanur is not only for cooking the sacrifices in it. It's also used for baking the bread, or the baking the bread of the menachos offering, of the grain, of the wheat, of the grain offerings. And so as a result, the ika bishul bilua. And so as a result, there is going to be cooking and absorption in that oven. Abdina and Shalmatechas. And so as a result, we do need to make it out of metal, because even though because how do we, this is an important lesson here. How do they cook bread in the ovens of old? They would literally stick the bread, the raw dough, against the wall of the oven. And so as a result, that wall of the oven would naturally absorb the bread. And so as a result, we're not only cooking using a skewer, but sometimes we're cooking against the wall. And so as a result, that's why Abdin and Shalmatechas, we need to make it out of metal. So the next piece is a longer piece that will, is a little more involved. And so we'll cover that, God willing, tomorrow. And so because the next we're going to talk about the issue of bread baked with animal fat or with dairy. Bottom line is that in general, we do not encourage or even allow bread to be either meat or dairy, because we're concerned, especially dairy bread, we're concerned that you may end up coming to eat it with meat, because meat was often the source of much of their meals. And so if you have bread, which is going to usually be used, it's going to be problematic. And not only that, but then also there's bread that often will get dipped in a special dip that's dairy. And so we are going to discuss those rules, God willing, tomorrow, and looking forward to continuing our learning, God willing, then. So we will pick up from Hahu Tanura, God willing, tomorrow, looking forward to continuing are learning together. Have a wonderful day.